I didn't cry when the pickup truck slammed into my SUV. I cried 10 minutes later when my father calmly told me over the phone we're already on the way to the airport. That was the moment I realized I'd spent 37 years misunderstanding what family really meant. If you'd asked me that morning whether I trusted my parents, I would have laughed. Of course I did. They were my parents. Why wouldn't I? My name is Natalie. I'm 37 years old, and I work as a healthcare technology project manager in Seattle. My job is to find problems before they become disasters. At work, I question everything. I verify numbers, I catch mistakes, and people trust me because I don't make decisions based on assumptions. But the funny thing is, the biggest mistake I ever made had nothing to do with my career. It had everything to do with the people I trusted most. Outside of work, my life revolved around my 7-month-old daughter, Emma. Every plan I made started with her. I had emergency savings, backup childcare, insurance, and a folder of important documents just in case life surprised me. I believed I was prepared for almost anything. Almost. There was one thing I never planned for: needing protection from my own family. My father, Richard, had recently retired from running an HVAC business. My mother, Linda, was a retired elementary school teacher. They weren't wealthy, but they had always worked hard and I respected them for it. Helping them felt like gratitude. Over the last couple of years, I'd sent them money whenever they needed it. Sometimes it was a home repair, sometimes medical bills, sometimes car problems. Dad always had the paperwork ready, and every request sounded reasonable. Whenever I told him he didn't have to thank me, he always answered the same way: families help each other. I'd been hearing those words since I was a little girl. Eventually, they became part of who I was. They explained why I never kept score, why I never expected anything back, and why helping my parents always felt like a choice instead of an obligation. That belief started almost 20 years ago. I was 19 when my college tuition suddenly increased halfway through the year. Even with scholarships, I still couldn't afford the next semester. I remember sitting at our kitchen table trying to figure out which classes I would have to drop. Dad quietly left the room. About an hour later, he came back and told me he'd arranged a small bank loan so I could stay in school. I hated the idea of him borrowing money because of me, but he wouldn't let me argue. Years later, after my career took off, I offered to pay every dollar back. He just smiled, shook his head, and gave me the same answer he'd always given: families help each other. I never forgot that moment. It wasn't about the money, it was about knowing my father believed I was worth sacrificing for. So, helping my parents felt natural. I wasn't repaying a debt, I was passing love back to the people who had first given it to me. Or so I believed. The day everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I led 2 executive meetings, approved a software rollout, answered emails, and left the office a little early to pick up a prescription before getting Emma from daycare. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind you forget almost as soon as it happens. I remember stopping at a red light. I remember thinking about whether Emma had started crawling yet. Then I heard tires screaming behind me. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw a pickup truck coming towards me far too fast. There wasn't enough time to move. The impact threw my SUV forward so violently that my head snapped against the headrest. For a second, everything disappeared into noise. Then, silence. I didn't know how badly I was hurt. I didn't even know where my phone had landed. I didn't even know if my car was still in the right lane. There was only one thought in my head: Emma. She wasn't in the car. She was still waiting for me at daycare. And I had no idea that getting to her would soon become the least painful part of my day. The next thing I remember is a paramedic leaning over me, asking if I knew my name. I did. Barely. My head was pounding, my ribs were on fire, and every breath hurt. "Is there anyone else in the car with you?" they asked. "My daughter wasn't with me," I gasped. That was the only good news. Emma was still safe at daycare. At the hospital, after hours of x-rays and CT scans, the doctor finally gave me the verdict: a fractured wrist, bruised ribs, and a mild concussion. Painful, but I was going to be okay. But I couldn't relax. I looked at the clock. Daycare closed in less than 3 hours. "I'll figure it out," I told the nurse, and I honestly believed I would. I called my best friend, Grace. She didn't hesitate. She said, "I'm on my way." 40 minutes later, Grace rushed into my room, still in her work clothes. She immediately went into problem-solving mode. "I'll get Emma. Do not worry." For the first time all afternoon, I could breathe. Grace picked up Emma, brought her to the hospital so I could see her, and stayed until my paperwork was ready. But she couldn't stay overnight. Her husband was out of town, she had 2 young boys at home, and her neighbor could only watch them for a few hours. "I hate leaving you like this," Grace said, squeezing my shoulder. "You've already done more than enough," I told her. "Go home." Once Grace left, the room got incredibly quiet. Emma was still fast asleep in her carrier, and I picked up my phone again. I called the daycare to ask for emergency overnight care. The director was sweet, but everyone she trusted was booked. I called 3 emergency nanny agencies. The first couldn't get anyone to me until tomorrow. The second didn't answer. The third didn't cover my area. I called my coworker, David. He answered right away, sounding genuinely worried. "Natalie, I wish I could help, but my wife and I flew to Chicago this morning. We're not even in the state." Another door slammed shut. I looked down at my contact list. There was only one name left: my dad. I didn't want to make that call, but Emma was his granddaughter. I didn't need money, I just needed someone to watch her for one single night. I pressed dial. He answered on the second ring. I told him about the accident. He sounded concerned, asking how badly I was hurt. I told him I'd survive. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Dad, could you and Mom keep Emma tonight?" Silence. Just a brief, heavy silence on the line. Then he said quietly, "We can't today." I thought he hadn't understood. "It's only for tonight, Dad. I'll figure everything else out tomorrow." Another pause. Then he sighed. "Natalie, Jason has been looking forward to this trip for years." Jason is my younger cousin. My parents had promised to take him on a graduation trip. I knew all about it. I'd even helped Dad book the hotels. "I know," I said, my voice cracking, "but I'm just asking for tonight." Dad didn't raise his voice. He wasn't angry. He just sounded calm. Far too calm. "We're already on our way to the airport." I waited. I waited for him to turn around or that Mom would come help. Instead, he just said, "You'll have to call someone else." That was it. No excuses, no hesitation, just a flight they didn't want to miss. The line went dead. I had thanked him automatically before hanging up. I don't even know why. I just stared at my screen. Somehow the silence after that call hurt so much more than the impact of the truck. My father had spent my entire life teaching me that families help each other, but now, when I needed him the most, he chose an airplane. I looked over at Emma, still sleeping peacefully. Whatever was happening with my parents, it had to wait. She came first. I did one more search on my phone. I found a licensed emergency childcare service and booked a professional overnight nanny. The price was painful, but I booked her without a second thought, because my daughter needed someone, and for the very first time in my life, that someone wasn't my family. I was discharged from the hospital the following afternoon. Physically, the doctors said I was going to be fine. My wrist would heal, my ribs would stop hurting, and the concussion just needed time. Emma was safe too. But the silence of my empty house felt heavier than before. As I struggled to lift Emma's car seat with my one working hand, my father's voice kept echoing in my head. "You'll have to call someone else." It wasn't just the words, it was how easily he'd said them. No hesitation, no guilt, just absolute cold certainty. For the first couple of days, I focused on recovering and taking care of Emma. But no matter how busy I kept myself, that one phone conversation refused to leave my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. A few days later, while Emma was taking her afternoon nap, I sat at my kitchen table. For the first time since the accident, I picked up my phone and opened my banking app. My eyes went straight to one specific recurring transaction. Recurring transfer. $4,600, scheduled for the first of every month. Recipient, Richard Carter. My thumb hovered over the screen. Cancel recurring transfer. One tap. That was all it would take to stop the money. I almost did. My finger came within millimeters of the glass. But then I stopped. I put the phone face down on the table. "No," I whispered to myself. "Dad must have a reason." If I canceled that payment, I was admitting that I no longer trusted my own father. I was cutting off the family I had spent 37 years believing in, and I wasn't ready to face that reality. Not yet. Instead, I tried to rationalize it. Over the past 2 years, every request of his had sounded completely reasonable. A leaking roof, a broken truck transmission, mom's expensive medicine, always accompanied by detailed estimates or official paperwork. Every single time, his favorite phrase echoed in my mind: families help each other. None of those expenses were fake. The roof really was repaired. The truck really had mechanical issues. So why did my chest feel so tight? Old habits from my job as a project manager die hard. Whenever something doesn't add up, I check the numbers. I grabbed a notebook from my desk. With my left hand holding the pen awkwardly, I began listing every major expense my father had claimed over the past 24 months. Roof, truck, medication, taxes, and house repairs. One by one, I wrote down the approximate amounts he had asked for, then added them together. I checked the total twice, then a third time. My heart sank. I kept my eyes on the numbers, but the math simply did not work. The recurring transfer was $4,600 every single month. That is over $55,000 a year. But the actual bills Dad had sent me over the last 2 years didn't even come close to half of that total. Where was the rest of the money going? I looked down at the notebook, desperately trying to make excuses for him. Maybe there were other bills he was too proud to tell me about. I wanted to believe that so badly. I wanted to remember the man who had quietly taken out a loan when I was 19 so I wouldn't have to drop out of college. That father wouldn't lie to me. He just wouldn't. Suddenly, my phone lit up. The caller ID showed my grandmother, Dorothy, a retired accountant who noticed details everyone else missed. I answered immediately. "Hi, Grandma." She asked how I was feeling, but there was a heavy, unnatural silence on the line. "Natalie," her voice was quieter than usual, more careful. "There's something you need to know." "What is it?" I asked, my injured ribs aching. "I'd rather tell you in person, and I think you deserve to hear it from me before anyone else." The line went dead. I slowly lowered my phone. On the screen, the banking app was still open, and the transfer was still scheduled. I still hadn't canceled it. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for excuses anymore. I was ready for the truth. Grandma Dorothy came over the next afternoon. I've known her my entire life, but I'd never seen her hesitate before ringing my doorbell. She stood on my porch, adjusting her coat, looking older and more nervous than I'd ever seen her. Dorothy Hayes is my mom's mother. As a retired accountant with over 40 years of experience, she only cares about hard data. She isn't dramatic, she doesn't gossip, and she never speaks without absolute proof. The moment I opened the door, I knew this wasn't a casual social visit. She hugged me carefully, avoiding my injured ribs, and looked down at my splinted wrist with a frown. We walked into the kitchen, and she waited quietly until I put Emma down for her afternoon nap. Once we were sitting at the table, she looked at me with a gravity that made my stomach drop. "Natalie," she said, her voice unusually soft, "I need you to promise me you'll just listen until I'm completely finished." I promised. She took a slow, deep breath, clasping her hands together. "I never wanted to get involved in your parents' finances, but a few weeks ago, your mother asked me to help organize their retirement accounts because she was feeling overwhelmed. You know she's never had a head for paperwork. Your father has always handled everything." She paused, taking a moment before continuing. "But as I reviewed their bank statements, the more I looked, the more things stopped making sense. First, the moment your transfer cleared, your father immediately moved a massive chunk of it, sometimes $3,000 or more, into a completely separate account, an account your mother's name isn't even on. Then I compared their actual living expenses with their income. Nothing suggested they were struggling. Their bills were standard. And finally," she stopped, looking directly into my eyes, "I discovered they'd paid off their mortgage 8 years ago." The words hung in the quiet kitchen. For a moment, I couldn't make sense of what she'd just said. My mind scrambled, trying desperately to find a loophole, an excuse, anything to protect the image of the father I loved. "What? No, that's impossible," I stammered, my voice cracking. "Dad has talked about the mortgage multiple times over the last 2 years. He said interest rates and housing costs were killing them. Maybe Mom doesn't know. Maybe Dad had to refinance or take out a home equity loan." "No," Grandma replied, her voice firm and steady. "I went to the county records office before I came here today. I pulled the deed myself. The mortgage was fully satisfied and paid off 8 years ago. There are no secondary loans on that house. None. He lied to you, Natalie." I looked out the window. Outside, the world was exactly the same. The sun was shining through the glass, my neighbor was mowing his lawn, and my daughter was sleeping peacefully in her crib down the hall. Everything looked normal, but the foundation of my entire life had just shattered. My parents didn't have a mortgage. They hadn't had one in 8 years. Every single excuse I had made for my father over the last 48 hours was instantly erased. I remembered sitting at this very table, staring at my phone, refusing to cancel that recurring transfer because I believed his favorite phrase, "Families help each other." I had believed my father was a man of sacrifice. Now I was looking at the truth. He had been taking thousands of dollars from me, month after month, using fake bills and non-existent mortgages as bait. Grandma reached across the table and placed her warm hand over mine. She didn't tell me my father was a monster. She didn't tell me what I should do next. She just said one quiet sentence that chilled me to the bone. "Natalie," she said, "I think there are things going on that you don't know yet." And for the first time in my life, I was terrified of what the numbers would show. Grandma Dorothy didn't say another word. She just reached into her bag, pulled out a thick folder, and placed it on the kitchen table. "I brought copies," she said quietly. "I'm not going to tell you what I found, Natalie. I think you need to see it for yourself." I slowly opened the folder. The first page was my parents' monthly bank statement. Grandma hadn't highlighted anything. She wanted me to follow the numbers on my own. Near the top of the page, my eyes found what I expected, a deposit of $4,600, my monthly transfer. But as I looked closer, a chilling pattern emerged across every single statement. Within days of my deposit clearing, a massive chunk of the money, sometimes $3,000, sometimes more, would immediately vanish. It was always transferred online to a separate account. Month after month, the sequence was identical. My money went in, and then it immediately flowed out. "This can't be a coincidence," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Grandma didn't answer. I turned to a page that contained transfer details, and that was when my breath caught in my throat. Beside the outgoing account number was a name: Jason Carter. I stared at the letters. For a long, agonizing moment, the room went completely silent. My brain simply refused to connect the name on the page to the person I knew. Jason is my cousin, my dad's nephew. He practically grew up with us. I had always been so proud of him, buying him graduation gifts and celebrating his achievements. But there his name was, staring back at me from my father's bank statement. "No," I said, shaking my head, my voice suddenly raw. "There has to be another Jason. This can't be him." "There isn't another one, Natalie," Grandma said softly. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Every single month, my hard-earned money was being funneled directly to Jason. All those frantic, emotional phone calls from my dad over the last 2 years, the leaking roof, the broken truck, the expensive medical bills, they were just a cover story. My father had weaponized my love and trust to fund his nephew's life. "Did Mom know about this?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I don't believe she did," Grandma replied. "She trusted him just as much as you did." We were both being lied to by the head of our family, but the worst was yet to come. I reached the very last page of the folder. It was the statement from this month, the month of my car accident, the month my father told me he couldn't help with Emma because he was on the way to the airport. My hands shook so badly, the paper rattled. I found my transfer of $4,600, and then 3 days later, there was a payment made directly to a travel agency. The description read, "Hawaii Vacation Package." I froze. The kitchen suddenly felt suffocatingly small. My father hadn't refused to help me because they couldn't afford to cancel their flights. He refused to help me because my money had paid for their luxury vacation, and he didn't want to ruin the trip I unwittingly funded. While I lay in a hospital bed with broken ribs and a concussion, wondering who would care for my 7-month-old daughter, my parents were boarding a plane paid for by my sweat and tears. A tear splashed onto the paper, smudging the ink. I wasn't crying because of the money. I was crying for the 19-year-old girl who believed her father had sacrificed his own savings to keep her in college. I was crying because every single month for 2 years, my transfer was a message of pure love, and every single month, my father chose to betray it. I wiped my face and picked up my phone. The banking app was still open, and my monthly transfer was scheduled to go out in just a few days. My thumb didn't hesitate this time. I opened the recurring transfer, pressed cancel, and confirmed it. The scheduled payment disappeared from the screen. And with that one tap, the last excuse I had ever made for my father vanished. I canceled the reoccurring transfer on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't call my parents, send a warning text, or make a dramatic announcement. I just opened my banking app, hit the button, and stopped the money. For the first time in nearly 2 years, my account remained untouched. I spent that evening staring at the quiet screen, wondering how long it would take my father to notice. It didn't take long at all.
The very next morning, while pouring milk for Emma, my phone began to vibrate on the counter. The screen read, "Dad." I stared at it, my heart taking a heavy dip. A foolish part of me hoped he was calling to apologize, that he'd finally realized how much he'd hurt me. I swiped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. "Hi, Dad," I said, keeping my voice neutral. He didn't ask how my wrist was healing. He didn't ask how Emma was doing, or if I was back at work. Instead, the first words out of his mouth were cold, sharp, and direct. "Did you stop the transfer?" The sheer coldness of his question left me speechless. No hello, no how are you, no I'm so sorry about your accident, just a demand about his missing money. I finally managed to quiet the lump in my throat and whisper, "Yes." There was a sharp silence. Then Dad spoke, his voice tight. "You should have talked to me first, Natalie. You don't just cut people off without a word." I closed my eyes, almost laughing at the irony. "You should have talked to me first, Dad? When were you planning to tell me where my money was actually going?" He didn't even pause, he just shifted the blame. "Your grandmother had no right to interfere. She had no business digging through my statements." "My grandmother didn't interfere, Dad. She helped Mom, and then she showed me the truth. You've been taking my money and sending it to Jason for 2 years." "I was helping Jason," he corrected me instantly, as if changing the words somehow excused the deception. "He's family, Natalie. Families help each other." "So am I, Dad. I'm your daughter. If this was about helping family, then why didn't you just ask me?" There was another long, suffocating silence. Finally, my father spoke the words that broke whatever remaining hope I had left in him. "Because I knew what you'd say. You would have said no." I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "No, Dad. I would have asked questions. I would have wanted to know why he needed thousands of dollars every single month and why you were using fake bills to cover it up." But Dad ignored my point, rushing into a justification that made my blood run cold. "You've always done well, Natalie. You have a great career, you own your home, and you'll always make more money. You've always had more than Jason ever will. I was just trying to keep things balanced." Balanced. Hearing him use that word felt like a physical blow. I had built my career with endless late nights and sacrificed weekends, yet my father was telling me that because I worked hard, my cousin was somehow entitled to my money without me being asked. "Dad," I said, my voice barely holding together, "if you had just called me and told me Jason was struggling, I probably would have helped him. I love Jason. But my problem is that you never gave me the choice. You decided what I could afford and where my money belonged. You took away my choice, and you never once thought I deserved to know the truth." The line went quiet. When he finally spoke, there was no apology. He just asked, "So you're not sending anything anymore?" I closed my eyes. Even after everything we'd just said, he still didn't get it. I was talking about trust. He was still just talking about transfers. "No, Dad, I'm not. This was never about the money. It was about my choice. But I'll never know if I would have helped him because you never asked." Dad quietly said goodbye and hung up. I lowered my phone and sat in the silence of my kitchen. I wasn't shaking and I wasn't crying anymore. For days, I'd thought canceling that transfer would be the hardest thing I'd ever have to do, but it wasn't. The hardest part was accepting that the father who raised me on the belief that families help each other had forgotten the most important rule of all. Families don't rob each other of their right to choose, and once that choice is stolen, the trust goes right along with it.
After my conversation with Dad, I stopped waiting for another phone call. I stopped hoping someone would explain everything in a way that made it hurt less. Instead, I started fixing the parts of my life I could still control.
I was done reacting to other people's choices. It was time to start taking back my own life. First, I changed the locks on my house. My parents had owned a spare key for years. There was no dramatic reason. They had never walked in without permission. But trust isn't only about what someone has done. Sometimes it's about what you no longer feel comfortable assuming. Changing the physical locks took an hour. Accepting why I had to do it took much longer. Next, I called my daughter's pediatric clinic and removed my parents as her emergency contacts. For years, they'd been listed right below my name. It had seemed so obvious. If something happened to me, of course, my parents would take care of Emma. Now, I wasn't sure that decision still belonged on that form. I needed people in Emma's life who valued her safety over their own plans. I replaced their names with Grace Mitchell. Grace had already proven something my parents hadn't. When I desperately needed help, she came. She never paused to ask what was convenient for her first. She simply showed up. A week later, I met with Michael Ross, an estate planning attorney. Until then, I'd always believed estate planning was for when you got older, but my accident changed everything. Life doesn't wait until you're ready. I updated my will and created a trust for Emma. More importantly, I officially named Grace as her legal guardian if anything ever happened to me. Signing those documents was strangely emotional. Not because I expected something terrible to happen, but because I finally understood that love isn't just about trusting people. It's about actively protecting the people who depend on you. For the first time since the crash, I felt like I was making decisions instead of just reacting to someone else's. About 2 weeks later, my phone rang. It was Jason. I almost let it go to voicemail, but I took a breath and answered. He sounded incredibly nervous. "Natalie, Grandma Dorothy came to see me," he said, his voice cracking. "I need to tell you, I didn't know." I frowned, holding the phone tight. "What do you mean, Jason?" "I thought Uncle Richard was helping me from his own savings. He told me he'd saved money over the years for my education. If I had known that money was coming from you, Natalie, I never would have taken a single dollar. I am so sorry." Those words sounded completely different from my father's. They weren't defensive, they weren't excuses. They were just honest and raw. I believed him. I emailed Jason the transaction records Grandma had compiled. 3 days later, a bank transfer notification popped up on my phone from him. It wasn't for the full amount, but the memo line read, "First repayment, more coming." I set my phone down, feeling a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, someone had actually taken responsibility. Shortly after, I received an email from my mother. She didn't ask me to restart the monthly payments, she didn't defend my father, and she didn't blame Grandma. Instead, she admitted she had blindly trusted my father to handle their finances for decades. She wrote that she should have asked questions and paid more attention. She apologized, deeply, not for losing the money, but for losing my trust. I read her words 3 times and cried. It didn't fix the broken pieces of our family, but it was a start. It was the first real apology I'd received, completely free of excuses. I replied with a single sentence, "Thank you for telling me the truth." A few evenings later, Grandma Dorothy came over with dinner. After Emma fell asleep, we sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear. We sat in silence for a long time before Grandma spoke. "You know, Natalie, the truth has a strange habit," she said, giving me a small, tired smile. "It almost always arrives late." I nodded, looking out into the dark. She was right. The truth had arrived too late to save my relationship with my father, too late to change what happened on the day of my accident. But it had arrived early enough to help me protect my daughter. And this time, that was the only family decision that truly belonged to me.
2 days after Jason called me to apologize, my grandmother Dorothy rang. She didn't sound like an accountant reviewing numbers anymore. She sounded like a matriarch drawing a line in the sand. She told me Jason had practically begged to see me in person, but he was too ashamed to face my house alone. So Grandma Dorothy organized a family meeting at her old house, the quiet craftsman home where we used to spend Sunday dinners before the lies tore us apart. She made one thing absolutely clear. This was not a meeting for forced forgiveness, but a space to force the truth into the open, once and for all. When I pulled into her gravel driveway that evening, my hands were tight on the steering wheel, my heart pounding against my healing ribs. Inside the living room, the atmosphere was thick enough to suffocate. My father, Richard, sat defensively in the armchair by the window, while my mother, Linda, sat on the sofa beside him, with her eyes fixed entirely on her lap. Across from them was Jason, slumped forward, his face red and his hands trembling violently. Grandma Dorothy sat at the head of the dining table, watching the room with sharp, unblinking eyes. No one said hello, and the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a slow countdown. Jason was the first to break, looking up at me with eyes instantly filling with tears. "Natalie, please, you have to believe me. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." He wiped his face with a shaking hand, looking over at my father with a mixture of confusion and deep betrayal. Uncle Richard told me this was money he'd saved for me over the years. He told me he had an old retirement fund he didn't need, and he wanted to make sure I could finish my master's degree without drowning in debt. He told me it was a gift from him. He covered his face, his shoulders shaking as the guilt poured out of him. "I took your money, Natalie. If I had known that money was coming from your sweat and your family's security, I would have slept on the streets before taking a single penny." He looked directly into my eyes, raw and broken. "I'm selling the bike tomorrow. I'm taking a second job. I will pay back every single dollar, Natalie. Even if it takes me the rest of my life, I will return what was stolen from you." Listening to him, the anger I had carried toward Jason completely melted away. He wasn't the predator. He was just another pawn my father had used to play his twisted game of family management. The room remained dead silent after Jason finished, but the tension shifted entirely toward my father. Richard didn't flinch, nor did he look at his nephew or me. He just shifted slightly in his chair, exhaling a loud, impatient sigh through his nose, as if this whole confession was nothing more than an inconvenient waste of his time. Right after my father's dismissive sigh, the most unexpected thing happened. My mother, Linda, who had spent 40 years quietly agreeing with him, managing his temper and nodding along to his rules, slowly lifted her head. She looked at the man she had shared a bed with for 4 decades, her eyes wide with a cold, sharp anger I had never seen in her before. "You didn't just lie to Natalie, Richard," she said, her voice quiet but incredibly steady, cutting through the room like a razor blade. "You lied to me." My father turned his head sharply in shock, opening his mouth to interrupt, but Mom raised her hand, shutting him down instantly. "No, you listened to me. For 2 years, you told me we were struggling. You made me feel like a burden in my own home. I lay awake at night feeling sick to my stomach because I thought we were bankrupting our own daughter. You let me believe we were drowning just so you could secretly play the benevolent savior to your nephew. You stole Natalie's money, but you stole my dignity, Richard. You turned our marriage into a theater of lies." It was the first time in my entire life I had ever heard my mother stand up to him, and the fragile illusion of their perfect traditional partnership vanished right there on Grandma's living room rug. Before my father could recover, Grandma Dorothy leaned forward, tapping her knuckles firmly against the dark wood of the table. The retired accountant locked her gaze entirely on Richard. "Richard, let me ask you a simple question. If Natalie had known the truth about Jason's situation, do you think she would have helped him?" My father swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as his eyes darted toward the floor. He knew my character better than anyone.
Maybe not, he muttered defensively. She would have had conditions. She would have wanted to see his grades, his budget, his spending habits. She would have made him jump through hoops. Grandma Dorothy let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head with profound disappointment. Then it was never about helping family, Richard. It was about controlling her choice. You stole from her because you knew she would say yes with her eyes open, and you couldn't handle the fact that your daughter was smarter, more successful, and more responsible with her money than you ever were. You wanted the glory of being the provider, but you wanted her to foot the bill without having a voice. Despite the absolute destruction of his arguments, my father refused to break, hardening his expression into that familiar, stubborn mask. "I did what I thought was right," he said coldly, devoid of any regret or sorrow. "Jason needed the help, and Natalie had the money. I'm the head of this family, and I made an executive decision to balance things out. I'm not going to sit here and apologize." In that exact moment, a cloud lifted from my mind. Looking at him, I realized he would never change, and the man I thought was a pillar of sacrifice was just a deeply insecure controller. I stood up slowly, picking up my car keys from the table as the metallic jingle echoed in the silence. My voice was calm and clear as a winter morning. "You taught me since I was a little girl that families help each other, Dad. But today, standing in this room, I finally understand something you never learned. Family isn't the person who gets to decide for you. Family is the person who respects your choice." I turned my back on him, looked at Jason and Mom with a gentle nod, and walked toward the front door. No one tried to stop me, and as the heavy wooden door clicked shut, the cool night air hit my face, leaving me completely free and finally able to breathe.
A year has passed since the day my father told me to call someone else. Sometimes people ask what happened after that. Did my family ever go back to the way it was? The honest answer is no. Some things can be repaired. Trust isn't always one of them. The recurring transfer never started again. Now my $4,600 stays exactly where it belongs until I decide where it should go. Instead of sending that money to my parents, I divided it into 3 places. The first portion went into Emma's college fund. The second became our emergency savings. After the accident, I understood that security is something you quietly build before life tests you. The final portion went somewhere I never expected, a local nonprofit that helps single mothers facing financial emergencies. When I made that first donation, I thought about lying in that hospital bed, desperately searching for someone to watch my daughter for just one night. If another mother ever finds herself in that position, maybe my contribution will help her hear a different answer than the one I received. That thought brought me more peace than any recurring transfer ever had. Jason kept his word. Over the next year, he sold his motorcycle, took on extra consulting work, and slowly paid back almost everything. Every time we spoke, he repeated the same sentence: "I still owe you accountability." Somehow, those words mattered more than the money ever could. Mom and I slowly found our way back to each other. Not all at once, but through small choices: a phone call, a visit, an afternoon at the park with Emma. She never asked me to forget what had happened, and she never defended Dad. She simply accepted that rebuilding trust happens one honest moment at a time. Today, she still sees her granddaughter, not because anyone demanded forgiveness, but because she earned another chance through truth. Dad was different. He never truly apologized. Eventually, I stopped waiting. Some people respond to losing trust by changing. Others simply learn to live without it. Dad chose the second path. I eventually realized that healing a relationship requires 2 people. I could leave the door unlocked, but I couldn't make him walk through it. A few weeks ago, Emma and I were playing in our backyard. She's old enough now to run across the grass without looking back to make sure I'm following.
Watching Emma run across the yard, I realized something I wished I'd learned years earlier. Loving your family should never require surrendering your judgment. You can be generous without giving up your right to choose. That's the lesson I hope my daughter grows up knowing long before she's 37. I couldn't change the day my father told me to call someone else, but as I watched Emma lass under the afternoon sun, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My daughter would never, ever have to hear those words from me.